Hello, this is John Feldt with Blue Water Outlook. This is a hydrometeorological assessment for Hurricane Sandy as of Friday at noon. Let's start off by taking a look at a couple satellite pictures. First one here shows very clearly that Sandy is located out to the east of the Florida area, north of the Caribbean region. It is moving to the north at about 6 miles an hour. In this visible picture, you can see that the circulation is pretty clearly shown right in here. I wouldn't call it necessarily a well-defined eye, but it certainly you can clearly see the circulation. Here are these bands of precipitation out to the north, fairly enhanced area of white here, white clouds, which is indicating higher clouds. Most of the precipitation is in that area currently in the northern quadrant and the northwest quadrant. It looks like there's probably some heavy rain out here to the northeast, but we don't have radar coverage in there, so it's really hard to say. If we look at radar, we see that some of the heavier rain is fairly close to the Florida coast, but with the system moving north and eventually northeast a bit over the next couple days, it might not be moving too far inland within Florida. We also see some outer bands to the north in this region as well. Now I'm going to be talking about precipitable water a bit here, something I think is very important. Blue Water Outlook talks about water aspects of this, the rainfall and the flooding. And precipitable waters usually are, if not always, very high with tropical systems. It's very efficient rainfall, and precipitable water is a measure of how much moisture is in the system all the way from the surface all the way through the atmospheric column. This is the current image that shows that at the current time, and red and whites are extremely high values of precipitable water. So you can see where Sandy is right now. We see extremely high amounts of precipitable water. So keep that in mind. We have this very large, totally drenched column of atmospheric moisture, tropical moisture, that's eventually going to go somewhere. Now, this is early next week on Tuesday, and what we see here, and I'm going to go back just a minute here. I want to point out that this is the driver that we've been talking about of what this system is going to do. This is a trough of low pressure that's digging from west to east, and what that's going to do is interact with Sandy and then going to determine what the eventual track is. And as you know, that's been fairly complicated over the last couple of days. Now, if we look at Tuesday, what we see here is we see that the trough now has pulled off to the eastern U.S., and what it has done is pulled that moisture from Sandy inland into parts of the mid-Atlantic into the northeast U.S. And that tropical moisture, that deep moisture, is going to be pulled into that area. You might say, is that unusual? Yes, it's highly unusual. I certainly don't remember a system like this that is tropical and then becomes extratropical in this abrupt manner with this type of turn. So it definitely is an unusual system, both for fairly late in the season, as well as many of the characteristics and trends that it looks like it might produce as we get into next week. Now here's the latest track from the National Hurricane Center. As I mentioned, it's moving to the north at 6. The maximum sustained winds are 80 miles an hour. It is the 10th hurricane so far this season. So you can see that, through the weekend, pretty much high confidence that as a Category 1 storm, it's going to be moving up towards the north and eventually towards the northeast. It's really not until late in the weekend, as we get late Sunday into early Monday, that we see some very abrupt changes, and the forecast track then is to move it up towards the northwest. This is the intensity forecast, and the white circles here show that at least currently it is expected to remain a Category 1 hurricane as it moves all the way up towards the northeast and then eventually onshore as a Category 1 hurricane. Even if there would be some intensification early on, most likely as it moves north, it would still be a Category 1 hurricane. As I mentioned, I talk about the water and the hydrometeorological aspects of the system, but I did want to point out these are the current wind probabilities for tropical storm force winds. And I do want to point out that this is going to be a very broad system. As it becomes extratropical, it's going to expand its wind field a bit, as well as its precipitation field. So keep in mind, this is going to be a very large, broad type pattern, and wind impacts are going to be very significant. Again, I don't talk about those aspects all that much. I stick with the water side of it, but I did want to point out that wind's going to be a big part of this system. Okay, so talking about water here, this is the 5-day forecast, and over the next couple days, this will be adjusted a bit. But I want to point out that this is really a setup for a historic type rain event. I see not only the tropical nature of this system, the high precipitable water, I see other factors that cause me concern as well. The fact that it's certainly pushing inland, that the speed will most likely slow a bit, the fact that it's a very widespread precipitation band, and finally that it's becoming interacting with an extratropical system or becoming an extratropical system. All these factors point towards enhancing the rainfall totals over parts of the mid-Atlantic states up towards the northeast U.S. So at least right now, and it's very early, keep in mind that we're looking at this rainfall going not just into the landfall of early next week, but probably into middle of next week at least. All the aspects to me right now that this could be a very heavy and maybe a historic rainfall event over that area. And I wanted to show you how the models have changed over the last couple days. You might remember Monday, the models were moving things off towards the east. That it was moving up ahead of that upper trough. It wouldn't be picked up. There were a couple models that were hinting maybe that solution. My weekly water outlook, I mentioned that most of them were going in this direction. But then by Tuesday, you started to see still mainly off to the east, but more started going in this solution. On Wednesday, pretty much split on both ways. So, one of the things when we look at a confidence, what I do is I look at, are the models starting, all these ensembles, these are different model runs, are they starting to be locked into one or the other? So what we see this morning, this is the latest ensemble model run, and all of the models seem to now be bringing it off towards the northwest. I think the biggest uncertainty now is not so much whether it's going to be moving up towards the northwest, but where it'll make this turn. Will it make the turn right here, or will it go a little bit further north and make that turn? Either way, keep in mind, it's such a large and broad system from a rain perspective. There's going to still be a very large area of the mid-Atlantic and the northeast that'll be receiving heavy rain. Now, I wanted to quickly look at some of the pre-existing conditions because that's going to be important as far as the eventual potential for flooding. And this is mid-Atlantic and the Northeast. And one thing we can look at is a 6-hour flash flood guidance. That's some indication of how saturated the upper soils are. And this is saying the green are the lower amounts, about 2 inches or so. And it's saying that parts of New York State up towards through Vermont and definitely Maine are a bit wetter than some of the areas of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. So it's sort of a mixed bag here. It's not definitely real saturated, but it's not dry either. Another way to look at this, and I think this is probably a little bit better way, is the last couple of weeks percent of normal rainfall. And what we do see here is we see a mixed picture over New England. What we do see is a blue are areas that are wetter, and the reds and yellows are areas that are drier. So we do see some areas of vulnerability, especially along the Vermont-New York state line, that could respond a little bit quicker. But I think I'd almost have to say sort of a wash as far as there's dry areas and wet areas. And overall, the vulnerability is probably towards the wet side in this region, but not excessively so. Now, if we get down into South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, West Virginia, you see a lot of red. That area can hold a lot more rain because it's been much more drier. So depending on where the system moves in, the response would be holding more rainfall, soaking in more rainfall in Virginia, and then as it transitions into the northeast U.S., you would probably see a much more significant response. Now, one other comment I want to make here is that tropical systems do affect the northeast U.S., but not nearly as much as areas down further south. One of the things that keep in mind that when a tropical system moves into the northeast U.S., you almost always have flooding. The geology and traits of the rivers and the runoff rates, topography, all favor or point towards flooding. So keep that in mind, that definitely, even if some of the initial parameters are more in the neutral range, there will still be significant flooding or the possibility. Now, if we look at stream flow from the USGS, green is normal, blue is above normal, red's below normal. Again, we see that many of the rivers in the northeast U.S. on the right there are in the normal range for this day of the year. And then in the mid-Atlantic region, we start to go from normal, and then as we go further south to below normal. There are a couple spots here and there, the blues that are above normal. Those would be more vulnerable towards flooding as they're starting off a bit higher. Now, I will be issuing updates on this throughout the event. I only wanted to cover so much today, but there'll be a lot to talk about over the next week. But the bottom line here, from a hydrometeorological perspective, from many different facets, this looks like a potential for a historic inland flood event over parts of the upper parts of the mid-Atlantic region up into New England. The main threat looks like it'll be far northern Virginia northward. I will be updating this briefing at least once a day, if not twice a day, for the next number of days until we get a good handle on the impacts of Sandy and its effects on the U.S. This is John Feldt with Blue Water Outlook. Thank you for listening.